He thought his robe would protect him forever, but when Judge Boasberg started shielding political insiders, Karoline Leavitt, the White House press secretary of the United States, turned the entire system on its head. Karoline Leavitt stood behind the podium in Tallahassee, hair pulled tight, voice calm but deliberate. She wasn't reading from a script, no teleprompter, no notes, just a stack of sealed documents, her eyes locked with every lens and journalist in front of her. "This is not political," she said. "This is about trust, and Judge Boasberg has broken it." That was the sentence that set off everything. It echoed across screens in living rooms, courtrooms, and conference halls. People didn't know what to make of it at first. A sitting judge facing criminal charges. It felt like something out of a political thriller, not Tuesday morning news. But Leavitt didn't flinch. Her voice cut through the noise of shocked murmurs. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Just 48 hours earlier, whispers had started circling inside the Department of Justice, quiet murmurs about a sealed file, an internal audit, and a highly sensitive case review involving Judge James Boasberg, a federal judge with years of experience, known more for his connections than his rulings, someone most Americans had never heard of until now. But Leavitt, in her role as White House press secretary, had been watching for months. The catalyst? A late Friday decision in a D.C. courtroom where Judge Boasberg issued a restraining order blocking the deportation of 5 individuals with suspected ties to Trania, a gang with a reputation that made even hardened ICE agents nervous. Leavitt believed it was more than bad judgment. She called it judicial sabotage. What stung even more was how the ruling was delivered, verbally vague with no written order to enforce. Homeland Security, operating under the assumption that the lack of a signed order gave them clearance, moved forward. Within hours, reporters were camped outside ICE field offices, and protesters lined up in front of federal buildings. But behind the scenes, something else had snapped. Leavitt had been in touch with DHS leadership and White House counsel that same night. "He's protecting criminals," she allegedly said in a closed-door call. "He's not interpreting the law, he's hiding behind it." That single call turned into action, and not just politically. What the public didn't know yet was that Karoline Leavitt's team, leveraging her position as press secretary, had already been compiling a case file. Quiet interviews with former clerks, internal memos from a whistleblower in the D.C. circuit, even encrypted message logs between Boasberg and former aides flagged in a side-channel investigation. Leavitt wasn't just upset, she was preparing for war. In her press statement, she didn't disclose the full list of charges, but she made it clear obstruction of justice was on the table, misconduct in office too. She hinted at a pattern of rulings that deviated from legal norms in critical national security cases. People watching that press conference weren't sure what shocked them more, what she said or the fact that someone was finally saying it. Cable news anchors fumbled with the breaking headlines, legal scholars scrambled to explain the ramifications, and in legal chat groups across the country, junior attorneys whispered the same question: is this really happening? Leavitt had always been tough, but this was something else. She was going after a sitting federal judge, and not just with rhetoric. She was aiming to dismantle his legacy, case by case, line by line. In the days that followed, her words were dissected on every network. Critics accused her of political retaliation, but supporters called her brave, finally holding the judiciary accountable. The nation was split, but one thing was clear. This wasn't a press stunt. Leavitt was serious. She'd pulled the pin. The explosion was just beginning. But what led her to this point? Why Boasberg? Why now? Long before the headlines, before the accusations, James E. Boasberg was considered untouchable. A Georgetown graduate, Yale Law alum with polished credentials and a network that spanned from K Street to Capitol Hill. To most people in the legal world, he was the guy you didn't mess with. Not because he was feared, but because he played the game right, at least on paper. He started his climb in Washington, D.C. years ago, first as an associate judge in the D.C. Superior Court, then elevated by President Obama to the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. In 2020, he became chief judge of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, a position that gave him eyes on some of the country's most sensitive national security matters. But over time, his decisions started raising eyebrows. It wasn't one moment, it was a pattern. In Honolulu, when the FBI came under scrutiny for errors in its surveillance applications, Boasberg was the one who reviewed the aftermath. His rulings were measured, some would say careful, but others saw them as weak. A slap on the wrist here, a warning there, no consequences, no deterrent. Critics began to whisper that Boasberg had become too comfortable protecting institutions instead of holding them accountable. Karoline Leavitt, as White House press secretary, was one of those critics. She had been keeping track silently while Boasberg's name kept popping up in cases with implications beyond the courtroom, especially cases involving immigration enforcement and the limits of executive power. To Leavitt, he wasn't just making controversial rulings, he was shaping the battlefield from the bench. And then came the restraining order on the deportations. That ruling was different. It wasn't just legally fuzzy, it felt calculated. Leavitt wasn't alone in thinking that. DHS officials were caught off guard. "We got no paperwork," said one internal email. "Are we really going to ground flights because of a hallway comment from a judge?" The answer, eventually, was no. The flights went ahead. That's when Boasberg threatened contempt proceedings. He accused the administration of defying court orders, but legal analysts pointed out a gaping problem. There was no enforceable written ruling. Behind closed doors, Leavitt's team was furious. This wasn't oversight, this was obstruction. She authorized a deep dive into Boasberg's court history. Not just rulings, but case management notes, clerk memos, inconsistencies in scheduling and personal communication patterns that showed possible conflicts of interest. And as they looked deeper, something strange kept surfacing. An unusual number of non-disclosed correspondences in cases involving encrypted technologies, namely Signal. Signal wasn't just a tech story. It was becoming a legal landmine. In early 2024, a lawsuit had emerged, small at first, then louder, accusing senior officials under the Trump administration of using Signal to coordinate decisions on sensitive operations without leaving a paper trail. When that case landed on Boasberg's desk, red flags went up, not because he was biased yet, but because he had close ties to several people named in the discovery process. Still, he didn't recuse himself. He kept the case, then quietly pushed hearings into closed chambers, sealed witness lists, and limited press access. Leavitt wasn't just irritated, she was convinced. She believed Boasberg had protected certain players in that case, either by shielding key evidence or delaying proceedings until the trail went cold. The DOJ started pulling call records, subpoenaing emails, and digging into timelines that didn't line up. And slowly a pattern started forming. Delays in hearings, missing filings, unexplained changes to access logs. Leavitt's theory? Boasberg was playing defense for people who didn't want those messages ever seeing the light of day. By the time the deportation order came down, Leavitt had already decided where this was going. It was only a matter of when she'd make it public. But it wasn't just legal maneuvering that pushed her. Something happened behind the scenes, something personal. The room was narrow, dimly carpeted, and smelled faintly of printer toner and coffee that had been sitting on a burner too long. Inside DOJ headquarters just off Constitution Avenue in D.C., Leavitt sat with a handful of senior advisors, arms crossed, jaws set. The white noise machine outside the door was humming, meant to keep conversations private, but the tension inside the room couldn't be masked. "We can't ignore this," she said, looking straight at Deputy Counsel Arlen Stokes. "Not anymore." On the table between them sat a folder, slim but heavy, the kind of folder that didn't need thickness to be dangerous, just the right 3 or 4 pieces of paper, perfectly timed. Inside were excerpts from encrypted Signal chats, recovered through a quiet third-party subpoena. Someone on the periphery of the case had cooperated. They didn't leak it to the press, they sent it straight to Leavitt's office. And there it was, a message sent from a federal staffer directly to Boasberg 2 months before he took the Signalgate case. The language was vague but telling. "They're planning to dump some of it in late March," it read, "but don't worry, Jay, I've got it covered on our end." Leavitt had read it twice, maybe 3 times, before she realized her hands were shaking. Stokes tried to play it down at first. Could be nothing, could be misinterpreted, but she wasn't hearing it. "It's not just this message," she said. "It's everything stacked behind it. The patterns, the redactions, the verbal orders with no paper trail, the hearings shuffled out of public view. It's all too clean. And then she dropped the line that marked a turning point for her team. "I'm not letting this get buried in some inspector general's report 3 years from now." That's when everything shifted. The next 72 hours were a whirlwind: legal prep, PR strategy, internal briefings with the Office of Legal Counsel. They didn't want a leak, they wanted impact. But here's what the public didn't see. 2 days before the press conference, Leavitt had a phone call with someone she trusted, an older federal judge in Phoenix who had been watching the Boasberg situation from a distance. No politics, no headlines, just years on the bench and a quiet understanding of how power works. "You sure about this, Karoline?" the judge asked. "I am. You'll burn a lot of bridges." "I'm not here to make friends," she replied. "I'm here to clean house." She didn't say it with anger, she said it with clarity. She knew what this would cost her politically, maybe personally, but she also knew what it would cost if she walked away now. Because this wasn't just about legal integrity anymore. Earlier that year, a mother in Corpus Christi had written Leavitt a letter. Her son, a border agent, had been seriously injured during a botched operation involving 2 men suspected to be linked to Trenya. They'd slipped through processing because of a court-ordered hold, that court order signed by Boasberg. The mother wrote, "We can't keep pretending that politics don't have real-world consequences. My son's spine is broken, he can't walk, and the man responsible is being shielded by a judge who won't show his face." Leavitt didn't forget that letter. She kept it in her desk, so when people later accused her of making this personal, they weren't entirely wrong. It was personal, but not out of spite, out of duty. And once she went public, once she named Judge James Boasberg and confirmed an open investigation, there was no going back. She was fully in, all of it. Her reputation, her position as White House press secretary, her credibility now tied to the outcome of this case. But as the story spread, another thread began to unravel, because Signalgate wasn't just about texts. It was about who was hiding behind them. The public didn't take long to latch on to the name. Signalgate hit the internet like a flood, and within days it was everywhere. TV panels, podcasts, Reddit threads. It wasn't just about a messaging app anymore. It was about who was using it, what they were hiding, and why someone like Judge Boasberg had tried to smother it in procedural dust. The story went deeper than most people realized. Signal wasn't new to Washington, but its rise during the Trump administration had alarmed certain corners of the intelligence community. Staffers, legal aides, even senior officials had begun using it during meetings, claiming it was to reduce leaks. But Signal deletes messages automatically, and in government, that's a problem because in government records matter. That's what the original lawsuit had been about. It was filed by a small watchdog group out of San Diego, and most people laughed it off at first. But when internal documents began surfacing, documents that showed scheduling conflicts, deleted calendar entries, and massive gaps in documentation, people started asking questions. Then came the names. Not just low-level assistants, real names, former national security advisors, an undersecretary of defense, even someone who had worked directly under Boasberg as a legal consultant during a review of surveillance protocols. And somehow, despite all of this, Boasberg stayed on the case. He didn't recuse himself. He didn't even acknowledge the connections in court. He simply scheduled a pre-trial hearing, closed it to the public, and issued a brief statement about ongoing procedural reviews. That's when Leavitt's team lost all patience. They deciphered the encrypted logs from Signal servers, not an easy feat, and not something done lightly, but there was a legal window tied to national security, and the DOJ pushed it hard. What they got back wasn't complete, but it was enough. One message in particular stood out. It was between a legal assistant on the lawsuit and a former DOJ staffer who had once worked under Boas. The message reads, "JB says we'll bury it in pre-trial. No panic, no files go public unless forced." 3 days later, Boasberg ruled to delay discovery. Now legally that could mean 100 things. Judges delay discovery all the time. But paired with the message, it looked like a chess move, a preemptive block. Leavitt didn't see a cautious judge, she saw a gatekeeper, one protecting people on both sides of the aisle from having their messages, their intentions, and their misconduct dragged into the open. And she knew the longer he held that bench, the colder the trail would get. She called a late-night meeting with her legal strategy team. If we don't act now, the window closes. This case gets sealed forever, and the public never hears a thing. One advisor, hesitant, asked, "You think he coordinated a cover-up?" "I think he knew who would be named," she said, "and I think he chose his loyalties." The phrase "chose his loyalties" would later get quoted in the Wall Street Journal, The Hill, and even NPR. It became a quiet rallying cry for those who saw Leavitt's campaign not as revenge, but as a fight to wrest control of the judicial process back from behind-the-scenes handlers. There was something deeply disturbing about how easily this had all been hidden, how a respected judge with decades of service had managed to delay, redirect, and obscure court actions tied to a scandal with national security implications. And for every step Leavitt took, pushback followed. One legal organization filed a complaint calling her actions an attack on judicial independence. A former law professor from Yale gave an interview, saying Leavitt was injecting politics into the judiciary. But the public was watching, and the question was simple. If Boasberg had nothing to hide, why wasn't he cooperating? But the answer to that question wasn't just about Boasberg anymore, because the deeper Leavitt dug, the more names started surfacing. By the time Karoline Leavitt filed formal charges, the ground was already shaking in D.C. She stood in the same press room, this time flanked by two senior DOJ investigators. No cameras were allowed inside during the internal briefings, but reporters were buzzing just outside, recording every word through the crack of an open door. Leavitt's voice, again, was calm, no theatrics, no fire, just facts. "We believe Judge James Boasberg has knowingly interfered with federal investigations, misused his authority to shield select individuals from scrutiny, and compromise the integrity of our justice system. The Department of Justice is pursuing formal charges." The list was precise. Obstruction of justice, misuse of judicial authority, willful concealment of evidence, and failure to recuse in a matter involving known conflicts of interest. Within hours, legal circles across the country ignited. Law firms sent emergency alerts to their litigation teams. Judges met privately to discuss the fallout. And inside federal agencies, emails with Boasberg's name in them were being quietly deleted or locked away behind restricted access. But what made this different, what made it real, was what came next. Leavitt's office released a small collection of internal messages, legally cleared for public review. None of them included classified info, but they were damning. There were suggestions that hearings had been moved to favor scheduling with particular legal teams. A text that read, "Keep this one in my courtroom, too risky for another judge." A short email to a former colleague marked "personal" that hinted at coordinating legal timelines around expected political changes. It wasn't smoking gun material on its own, but to the public, it felt like corruption dressed in a robe. Meanwhile, Boasberg went silent. No press statement, no court appearance, no official denial. His clerk issued a brief response. "Judge Boasberg has always served with honor and integrity and will respond through the appropriate legal channels." But that only made it worse. People wanted answers. They wanted him to face a microphone, to explain himself, or at least show some sign of accountability. Instead, his allies moved for him. Several political commentators on mainstream media began defending him, saying this was a witch hunt, that Leavitt was weaponizing her office, that she was trying to send a message to other judges who ruled against conservative interests. But for every critic she gained, she earned a louder wave of support. Ordinary Americans began speaking out. Veterans, small business owners, immigration officers, even former court clerks who had worked under Boasberg years ago. Some defended him, but more came forward with stories, some vague. Others detailed about quiet decisions that never made headlines but had affected real lives. A court translator from Laredo said she remembered seeing documents go missing from a deportation case that was reassigned to Boasberg's court at the last minute. A paralegal in Ohio claimed her team had once been told to hold off on filing because a friendly judge wanted to take jurisdiction. These weren't bombshells, they were whispers. But together they painted a picture. And Karoline Leavitt wasn't done. She gave one last interview before going completely off camera. The interviewer asked her if she feared the political consequences of charging a federal judge. Her response was simple: "Let the consequences come. I'd rather lose my seat than lose my spine." That quote hit hard. It showed up on coffee mugs, bumper stickers, and digital ads within hours. Her critics tried to mock it, but the damage was already done. The line stuck. Inside the courthouse, meanwhile, preparations began for pre-trial hearings. The process would be slow. Judges don't go on trial often, and even fewer face actual criminal charges. But it was happening, and people were watching. The lines were drawn now. You were either with Leavitt, believing the justice system needed a long overdue reckoning, or you were with Boasberg, defending the judiciary from what looked to some like a politically fueled takedown. But in the chaos of public opinion, a quieter storm was forming, because what came next wasn't about the courtroom, it was about trust. The trial hadn't even started, and yet the damage was already spreading. Inside a quiet courtroom in Alexandria, Virginia, Judge Boasberg finally appeared. He didn't walk in through the public doors. Marshals escorted him through the side hallway, away from the swarm of reporters outside. His suit looked pressed, but his expression, drawn and blank, told a different story. The man who once sat atop some of the nation's most delicate legal proceedings now stood as a defendant, flanked by attorneys and a tight jaw. The charges were read out in clear, clinical tones. The judge presiding over the hearing didn't show any visible reaction. No grandstanding, no cable news theatrics, just facts, motions, and paperwork. Boasberg pled not guilty. Outside, the crowd was mixed. Protesters, supporters, media vans lined the block. Some held signs that said, "No more shadow justice." Others waved American flags and chanted for Leavitt. You could feel the divide. But beneath it all was the same question on every face. Can we trust the people behind the bench? The judiciary had always seemed untouchable to most Americans. Judges weren't like politicians. They didn't campaign, didn't argue on Twitter, didn't show up on late-night shows. They just ruled. And people, for the most part, respected that, or at least accepted it. But now it felt like a mask had slipped. Leavitt stayed out of the spotlight in those first days after the arraignment. No press conferences, no follow-up interviews, just her team moving forward, quietly confident, but in private, she understood what had happened. She hadn't just filed charges. She'd cracked open a door no one wanted to admit existed. One morning, her assistant walked into her office holding a padded envelope with no return address. Inside was a letter, handwritten in shaky cursive. It was from a retired federal clerk in Santa Fe. The letter read, "I watched Judge Boasberg override a colleague in 2017 over an immigration hold. The case was never reported, no press." The man was released. 2 months later, he killed a sheriff's deputy in Oklahoma. We all knew it happened, but no one said a word. Leavitt didn't share the letter publicly. She didn't need to. The stories were surfacing on their own, one after another. Not all provable, not all clean, but consistent. Whispers of favoritism, private lunches with federal attorneys, phone calls that skipped official records, and rulings, always the rulings, that leaned just enough to raise questions, but never enough to demand attention. And still, Boasberg said nothing. His legal team gave brief comments. They called the case an egregious overreach, claimed he'd done nothing wrong, and painted Leavitt as a partisan soldier on a vendetta. But they couldn't explain the messages. They couldn't explain the scheduling delays. They couldn't explain why sealed court logs had quietly vanished before hearings tied to Signalgate. In Washington, people started choosing sides. Some legal analysts warned that if Leavitt succeeded, it would set a precedent no one was ready for, one where any judge could become a target of political backlash. But others argued that accountability wasn't a threat to the system, it was the foundation of it. Senators were split. Some backed her, others called for an investigation into her office instead. And still, she didn't flinch. Because beneath the noise, beneath the headlines, something else had shifted. Ordinary Americans, people who never cared much about legal hearings or federal judges, were now watching C-SPAN, reading court transcripts, following every update. It wasn't about Leavitt anymore. It wasn't even about Boasberg. It was about whether power still had limits. And in coffee shops, kitchen tables, and break rooms across the country, people were talking about justice in a way they hadn't in years. But one final piece still had to fall into place. The reckoning that would decide whether this was just a scandal or a turning point. It was a late spring evening when the verdict came down. No flashing lights, no triumphant music, just the sound of a gavel and the buzz of people shifting in their seats. Judge Boasberg was not found guilty on all counts. Some charges were dropped due to lack of hard evidence. Key messages had been erased long before the DOJ could get to them. But 2 charges stuck: willful concealment of evidence and misuse of judicial authority. The courtroom was quiet as the clerk read the words. Boasberg didn't move. His lawyers lowered their heads. The sentence: loss of his bench, permanent disbarment, and a recommendation for further federal review of his past rulings. No jail time, but no way back either. Karoline Leavitt didn't celebrate. She didn't hold a press event. She simply walked into her office, looked out the window toward the Jefferson Memorial, and whispered to herself. That's when she knew. This wasn't about just one man. It never was. In the weeks that followed, something rare happened. People stopped arguing, just for a moment, not about party lines or court politics, but about truth. For the first time in a long time, the public saw behind the curtain. Not into a conspiracy, not some grand puppet show, just into the messy, flawed, deeply human system that runs our justice. One clerk from Boasberg's court gave an anonymous interview. He wasn't a villain, she said. He believed he was doing the right thing. But that's not enough. Not when you wear that robe. And that's the lesson Leavitt wanted people to walk away with. That power, real power, isn't about what you say in front of cameras. It's about what you choose when no one's watching. Boasberg had chosen silence, secrecy, and protection. Leavitt chose transparency, even if it meant putting herself on the line. She received letters from families who felt overlooked by the system, a man in Wichita whose son was deported despite being cleared of all charges, a woman in Bakersfield whose sister had been assaulted by someone released under a deferred hearing, one that had passed through Boasberg's courtroom without any public record. These weren't just sob stories, they were real consequences, real people. And for Leavitt, that was the whole point. In one of her few public appearances after the trial, she stood before a class of first-year law students at the University of Florida. No notes, just her voice. Don't chase headlines, she told them. Chase the truth, because if you don't, someone else will write your version of it for you. The room was silent. Some scribbled notes, others just stared, wide-eyed. And while critics still called her reckless, others began to ask harder questions. How many other judges were making quiet choices in shadow corners of the law? How many rulings were less about justice and more about protecting the machinery? The Justice Department quietly launched a new review system for internal complaints against federal judges. It didn't make front-page news, but it mattered, because now someone was watching. And that's what accountability is really about. Not fear, not revenge, but presence. Being there, watching, not looking away. Karoline Leavitt had given the system a bruise, yes, but sometimes a bruise is what it takes to remind the body where it's weak. And as the dust settled, the story faded from the front pages. Boasberg moved out of D.C., his name slipped out of the headlines, but the echo of his fall stayed in the chambers where others now sat. Robes freshly pressed, verdicts still in their hands. Personally, I see Karoline Leavitt's stand as a wake-up call, a reminder that justice isn't just a robe or a gavel, but a promise we all hold fragilely. Her courage to confront power head-on inspires me, showing that accountability can ripple beyond courtrooms into our everyday trust in the system. Yet, I wonder, was this a heroic purge or a risky overreach? Could targeting Boasberg weaken judicial independence, making judges pawns in political games? I lean toward her side, believing silence shields corruption more than it protects fairness. But I get the counterpoint. Stability matters too. What do you think? Did Leavitt restore faith or fracture it? Thanks for watching this deep dive into a story that's more than headlines. It's about us. Drop your thoughts below, hit that like button if it resonated, and subscribe to keep unpacking truth together